Every good story needs a mystery, and Arc Raiders is kind of full of them. In a previous video, we explored Asera Spaceport, piecing together clues from its layout and remnants to reconstruct the final days of humanity's golden age. When viewed alongside the Exodus and the arrival of the Arcs, a coherent picture emerged, one in which the Arcs weren't actually alien invaders at all, but instead human-made machines sent back to Earth likely to reclaim resources and reshape the planet for a future that no longer included the people who were left behind to survive. It was a pretty grim conclusion, but a convincing one given the details. Humanity was fractured, old hierarchies reasserted themselves, and Asera fit neatly into that story. But Blue Gate, well, it doesn't quite fit. Here, massive Arc Deforesters lie destroyed. Missions hint at survivors organized and advanced enough to challenge machines that most surface settlements can barely endure. And yet, no group has ever been seen. No contact has been made with Speranza. No territory has been claimed. All we find are just the remains of something powerful that happened and the absence of anyone willing to take credit for it. We also find a mountain underpass choked with abandoned vehicles, suggesting the same desperate rush for shelter seen at Asera. But closer inspection complicates that first impression. Massive steel blast doors seal the route, and a logo for a Manticore corporation appears on bunker networks, private military vehicles, and discarded riot gear. This doesn't feel like a temporary refuge. It feels like it maybe was deliberate. Why would a tunnel entrance require fortifications of this scale? Why would a private company field equipment more suited to a standing army than emergency response? And how does all of this connect to a quiet destruction of the Arc infrastructure in this region? Those were the questions that brought me back to the surface once more, to read Arc Raiders' story where it's most often told, in steel, concrete, and the spaces left behind between them, hidden among the mountains of Blue Gate. So I hope you'll join me after I tell you about today's video sponsor, Incogni. A few years ago, my identity was stolen, and I'm still dealing with the fallout from that today. It happened because my personal info, social security number, address, work history, all that was already on the internet floating around, being sold or hacked by whoever wanted it. And it's not just your name or email. Data brokers trade your phone number, relatives, shopping habits, even your full employment history. If one of those companies gets hacked, like what happened with me, it can get ugly fast. That's why I use Incogni. They get that data deleted right away. They reach out to the data brokers that have it for you and handle all that nasty back and forth. And now with their new custom removals feature in their unlimited and family unlimited plans, if you find out any of your information is on those people search websites out there, a privacy agent will reach out and get your info taken down. When I signed up, I found that over 90 companies were holding my personal info, and it kept growing after that. So no wonder I kept getting invited to those shady investor groups. So if you want a little bit more peace of mind like me, go on over to incogni.com/morphologist and use code morphologist for 60% off. And if it's not for you, you can always get your money back with their 30-day money-back guarantee. Again, that's incogni.com/morphologist. Before we start investigating on our own, I think it's first good to start off by looking at what the mission givers from Speranza tell us about the location. Now, Apollo describes Blue Gate as the edge of their reach. When we get sent out to establish a first foothold, it's clear that the tube network was only recently extended into the valley, and even now the work is still unfinished. Topside infrastructure was built in stages and repeatedly interrupted by Arc activity, leaving behind half-completed structures. Shani draws attention to something, though, a little bit more unsettling as we begin to explore the valley itself. Much of the destruction across the surface world is pretty old, the kind that's had time to settle into the landscape. The collapsed highway near Blue Gate, though, stands apart. It's recent, deliberate, and tied into the path of a deforesting machine that stripped the entire forest before being brought down. When Shani examines the wreckage, she rules out Speranza almost immediately, along with the survivors that we know of that pop up from time to time, just due to the fact that there's no signs of how the thing was brought down in the first place. By the time she asks us to follow the trail further, one assumption has already taken hold. Someone else is active here, not a lone survivor and not a small group just scraping by. Whoever brought down the Deforesters had resources and coordination to do so deliberately and possibly more than just once. Speranza doesn't know whether that makes them an ally or a threat, but the absence of contact is enough to raise some concern. Apollo adds that one final piece of the context when he points us to Pilgrim's Peak. Long before Speranza ever reached Blue Gate, the region was already significant. Exodus-era research took place here, focused on building structures meant to endure unstable ground and long-term environmental stress. Taken together, this is the ground truth that we're working from. A natural place to begin, then, is near the remains of the deforesting machines themselves, the curious thing that has started to spark this mystery. There are two major wreck sites in the region that I've been able to locate. The first lies near the stream to the west, where we're tasked with finding why this thing's collapsed. This area is littered with debris from multiple periods of time, including the hulks of disabled Barons, heavy combat-focused arcs that were from the first wave that we know of from history, which tells us that this location was contested more than once. The reason becomes clear when you follow that river north and slightly east. It leads directly to a pre-fall Italian vernacular village, perched just inside the lowlands. Close inspection reveals several layers of occupation here. Externally, there are signs of fortification, some older and likely dating to the immediate post-fall period, while others are more recent, marked by flags that align with Speranza's presence. Inside the buildings, the story continues. We know there was a period of time after the fall when humans re-emerged onto the surface and attempted to restart civilization before the first arcs ever arrived. A largely intact village like this would have been the ideal starting point to do such a thing. Scaffolding, construction materials, and generators are scattered then throughout here, giving us evidence of real progress being made before that effort was interrupted by that Ark invasion. The destroyed Barons downstream likely then belonged to that first confrontation. Machines were sent to erase a renewed attempt at settlement, and for here at least they seem to have been stopped. The village clearly still stands, which suggests the survivors managed to hold their ground, at least temporarily. Further downriver is a more forested stretch of area, and the picture here is a little bit less optimistic. If you look closely, parts of the settlement lie in ruins, including a partially destroyed church that shows both older and more recent signs of occupation, which signals that the village definitely endured, but parts of it may have been destroyed in that initial defense. What's striking, though, is what's not present. Between the post-fall occupation and Speranza's recent work, there's no evidence that this area has been inhabited since the retreat underground following the second wave. It actually then makes it unlikely that this place, and the people who once defended it, had anything to do with the recent destruction of these deforesting machines, which means that whatever force brought those machines down was operating somewhere else and under very different conditions. But what about that second deforester? What might that tell us about these people? Northeast of the ancient fort, and on the eastern side of the map, and roughly halfway up toward Pilgrim's Peak, lie the remains of this second destroyed Deforester. During one of the missions, we're sent out here briefly to investigate some seismic activity. Now, earthquakes in Italy, as you may be surprised to know, aren't that unusual. What stands out here isn't then the tremor itself, but how the ground failed around this area. The earth here has split apart and slumped downhill in a way that suggests a sudden loss of stability. The presence of intact pre-fall ruins nearby also tells us that this wasn't a chronic condition. Whatever caused the ground to give way happened recently in a place that had once been stable enough to build these more ancient structures. So then what changed exactly? Now, one of the biggest contributing factors to landslides during seismic events isn't the shaking alone, but what's holding the soil together. Vegetation, you see, especially deep-rooted trees, stabilize terrain. Remove it, and even moderate shaking can trigger catastrophic movement. That context then reframes the wreckage here. The strip slopes around the area suggest its work weakened the mountainside enough, turning a routine seismic event into a destructive landslide. Seen that way, the motivation for destroying it becomes possibly clearer. The goal wasn't to clear the surface of arcs indiscriminately. It was to stop a specific type of damage that threatened the long-term stability of the mountains themselves. And we know it wasn't indiscriminate because of the large amount of arc units that are still active in the region. Harvesters and even queens continue to appear in this area, and they're unchallenged. If the objective were to simply eliminate arc presence, that wouldn't make sense. But if the concern was integrity of the terrain, what happens beneath and beyond the surface, then the pattern begins to hold true. Whoever destroyed these machines was probably intervening selectively, drawing a line at actions that disabled the mountainside for some reason. Now, I already have my suspicions, but just to be consistent, if we examine this side of the valley the same way we did on the west side by looking for positions that would have needed to be defended, a similar picture here emerges. The ancient fort and nearby village to the south, all the way uphill to Pilgrim's Peak, all tell the same story. Post-fall reoccupation, resistance during the first wave, and much later, the lighter touch of Speranza's return. So our mystery group clearly isn't dwelling here on the surface. They weren't defending something up top. So then, what here can we find that breaks the pattern? Well, there are a handful of architectural oddities that I think are pretty clear, pretty obvious, and they all point back to the Manticore Corporation and the Blue Gate Tunnel project itself. East of the village, in the northern part of the map, lies a site labeled Reinforced Reception. A parking area and concrete stairway lead to an elevated structure built almost entirely of slanted reinforced concrete, with Manticore's name still emblazoned on its exterior clearly. From the outside, it reads less like an administration building and more like a bunker, a curious choice for what appears on paper to just be a traffic tunnel management facility. Similar structures appear elsewhere across the surface. There's an isolated archive bunker that sits just to the northeast, another reinforced structure lies southeast of the central checkpoint, and taken together, they suggest a distributed surface presence tied to something much larger down below. Subterranean construction on this scale is neither cheap nor incidental, especially in mountainous terrain. It requires long-term planning and a willingness to commit resources well before any immediate return. Stepping through the steel doors of the reception leads us to a controlled interior space, with elevator shafts descending into what appears to be a security and administration complex for the tunnel network below. It's a place we'll return to later once we begin tracing how everything is connected underground. The other major surface structure that demands attention sits just northeast of the central checkpoint, a fortified warehouse complex. Its access road, now barely visible beneath the decay and collapse, once linked it directly to the checkpoint itself down below. Once again, the construction feels excessive for its stated purpose. At this point, the pattern begins to feel familiar. When we examined Asera spaceport, one of the most unsettling details was how heavily fortified it was despite being constructed before the fall of humanity. Perimeter walls, security towers, underground transport networks ostensibly meant for cargo, and reinforced hangars embedded into surrounding cliffs all pointed to a project designed with some foreknowledge. Infrastructure was built not just to function, but to control access when the world was going to eventually break down. Manticore's work here at Blue Gate appears to follow a similar kind of logic. It's not the same project, and definitely not the same organization. We find no signs of the Manticore name anywhere at Asera, but the same underlying assumption that stability was temporary and critical infrastructure needed to be hardened in advance is the same. Seen this way, Blue Gate stops looking like a simple tunnel project and starts to resemble something far more intentional, something perhaps even a little bit insidious. Public infrastructure on the surface with far more serious purposes buried beneath it. If that's the case, well then, the tunnel itself needs closer inspection, so let's finally move to the checkpoint. Approaching the checkpoint from the highway, everything looks like you'd expect for a regulated entry to a vital piece of infrastructure. There are gas stations, inspection areas, maintenance garages, staff parking. Before the fall, commuters probably just looked at this and thought, this isn't anything unusual. Today, what stands out though is the volume of traffic frozen in place just outside the tunnel. It suggests that when the surface became close to uninhabitable, people probably treated this underpass as a possible refuge. Most of them clearly though didn't make it. The real oddity though is when you get closer to the mouth of the entrance and you realize that both lanes are interrupted by massive steel doors stuck partially open. The scale alone raises a big question. What does a tunnel project need doors like this for? Constructing and operating them would have required enormous power and resources. Their justification, at least publicly, then probably was for some kind of emergency containment or shelter, something that could have been sold as civic safety, perhaps. I very much suspect that they had to grease the pockets of some politicians in order to get the budget to do this in the first place, though, because even if that was the surface explanation, when people saw the numbers associated with this, it would have been astronomical. Then you start noticing the vehicles. Scattered along the entrance, armored cars sit parked directly where people would go in, painted with Manticore's name. Riot gear is also scattered around the area, stamped with the same logo. Whatever Manticore was, it wasn't only a construction company. It maintained a well-equipped security force. On paper, you could just say that they needed protection for the tunnel, but in practice, doors like these and vehicles like this suggest a different kind of problem, controlling access and preparing for the moment when people would demand entry. Past the first doors, the tunnel continues into the distance toward a second set of blast doors, and these appear in the distance to be closed. We'll return to them shortly. First though, I want to do a quick detour into the security and administration complex that we saw was connected to that entrance up on the surface. Through an offshoot road and maintenance corridor, you'll reach Manticore's underground admin center. Locating this facility underground is an expensive choice, especially when it could have been placed just as easily topside near the checkpoint. The decision only makes sense if the underground itself was the priority. With a bit of exploration, secure doors can also be found on the admin level to an elaborate control room. The kind of space you'd expect definitely to see at a major bit of infrastructure, but it's strange that it would be locked down behind these large blast doors. It's also a bit strange how nice the interior is. Almost as if they had planned to occupy this space more regularly. Certainly when people worked here, they would spend shifts here, but maybe they were thinking longer term. Well, let's finally now look then at those back access doors. Arriving at those rear massive blast doors, we find that the entrance to the deeper part of the tunnel is sealed shut and looks as though they've been so for a very long time, because just outside them are some makeshift shelters in a pretty good state of decay, as though the people here waited here after the fall to hopefully get in, or at least to seek shelter from what was happening outside. But more telling is that there's a roadblock with security vehicles that are ranged in a defensive line, with barriers placed as if to stop a surge. Nearby, there are pre-fall robots sitting abandoned in place, suggesting security may have been partially automated. So then, what were they preventing people from reaching beyond this point? Why build a second set of blast doors at all? One thing we can rule out is that beyond these doors is the other side of the tunnel, because if you go back and read the sign above the main entrance, you'll find Alt Station, and sorry if I'm murdering this in Italian, 800 meters ahead, suggesting a controlled station less than a kilometer inside. Yet these doors are clearly not that far into the mountain, and if you look from the outside, the mountain just continues on quite a distance, so this tunnel definitely continues far deeper. Whatever lies beyond wasn't then just the rest of the underpass, it was something that people really wanted to get to. And with that, I think we finally have enough to sketch a plausible sequence of events. So here's what I think might have happened. As the world entered its final phase of instability and the exodus began, those left behind would have been desperate for refuge. The surface was becoming increasingly hostile. A massive underpass like Blue Gate, complete with emergency blast doors and framed as a critical piece of infrastructure, would have appeared to many as a last chance bit of survival, place to seek refuge from the terrible climate. People likely came then in enormous numbers, by car, or fuel allowed, or on foot if that's all that was left to them. What they seemed to have encountered wasn't sanctuary though. Armored security, controlled access points, and multiple layers of blast doors suggest that the entry was never meant to be universal. Blue Gate may have been presented as a public piece of infrastructure, but it appears to have functioned very different once the crisis actually began. Something went wrong at the surface level though. The evidence suggests here that the outer checkpoint was breached. Too many people came and there was too little time to defend it, and the systems designed to filter rather than accommodate failed. Beyond that first point, security infrastructure sits abandoned in place. And if those first blast doors were already hard to justify, the second ones are even more so. But they are completely sealed. They were the failsafes, a guarantee that the access here would remain limited to whoever Manticore intended to protect. Whatever happened above, this system at least seemed to have held. If I'm reading this correctly then, Manticore was never just an infrastructure company. Like the organizations behind the project such as Asera Spaceport, they appear to have used a public-facing construction project as a cover for something far more selective. A bet that Earth, even badly damaged, would remain humanity's long-term best option. And that idea isn't actually that irrational. Earth is the only place that we know of for certain that can support human life long term. Preparing to endure a catastrophe beneath its surface may have seemed far more achievable than sustaining civilization in the vacuum of space. Some may have believed that the planet was going to be lost forever, while others believed that it would eventually recover given enough time. Seen through that lens, the later destruction of the deforesting arcs begins to make a lot more sense. If the self-sustaining refuge still exists beneath Blue Gate, then the large-scale deforestation above it would likely threaten the structural stability of what's below or even block the entrance to the large blue gates themselves. They probably chose not to act until now to keep themselves hidden, but had no choice when this threat arose. They probably hoped that the Exodus humans would mistake the destroyed Deforesters for something that Speranza survivors did. And it also suggests something else. They probably retained access to capabilities far beyond what the surface survivors possess. Technology that's a continuation from pre-fall. They would have preserved it, refined it, and probably learned how to use it in ways that don't seem obvious to trace. And if that's true, then their silence towards Speranza is probably not accidental. If these technologically advanced survivors do indeed exist, evidence points to them seeing the Exodus probably as rivals. They may see surface survivors as unrecoverable, nothing more than a rabble that will soon die out. If Manticore's legacy still endures beneath these mountains, as I suspect they do, then they may not be willing to rejoin the world just yet. They might just be waiting for the rest of us to finally die out, fighting each other before they resurface and take it for themselves. Whatever the truth is, though, I'm sure Manticore must somehow be linked to this mysterious group of survivors, and these complexes must also be connected. Maybe I'm wrong though, and they're friendly and we'll soon make contact and we'll find out that they want to help us out, but maybe we'll find that they're going to be an entirely new kind of foe to contend with. One that didn't want their presence to be known, but now has to contend with the fact that Speranza is starting to pick at the edges and may soon discover their existence, pitting us up against tech that may be just as challenging, if not more so, to defeat than those of the Arcs. But only time will tell. But what do you guys think? Did I miss anything? Is there any big clue that you want to contribute here to add to this puzzle to answer these big questions? Otherwise, if you want to see more lore videos like this, be sure to let me know down in the comment section below. So stay safe out there, Raiders, and I'll see you guys back at Speranza.